The vow was older than memory. Every generation spoke it at the blood moon, voices raised in unison beneath a sky that turned crimson and hungry. We pledge our strength to the pack. We submit our will to the Alpha. We are teeth and bone and loyalty until death takes us. The words had been carved into the standing stones at the heart of the territory 3 centuries ago, and for 3 centuries every member of the thorn-bound pack had spoken them without question. Until Rhea, until the night she stood before those stones, looked the Alpha King directly in his ancient eyes, and said the word no one had ever dared to speak. No, she was 27 years old, and had lived her entire life preparing to make that vow. The thorn-bound were not humans who played at being wolves, not shapeshifters from old stories. They were something older, something that existed in the space between civilization and wilderness. They lived in the deep forests of the Kale territories, in settlements that moved with the seasons, following patterns their ancestors had established before kingdoms had names. They were bound by laws that predated written language, by customs that had been passed down through blood and bone, and the kind of teaching that happened in darkness around fires that burned with colors no normal flame should hold. Rhea had been born into this world, daughter of the pack's tracker and a mother who died bringing her into existence. She'd grown up learning to read signs in bent grass and broken twigs, to move through forest so quietly that deer wouldn't startle, to understand the language of wind and water and the way moonlight fell through branches. She'd been taught the vows before she could fully speak, made to recite them every night until they were as natural as breathing. By the time she was 15, she could recite all 7 of the sacred oaths without thinking, could speak them in her sleep, could feel their weight settling over her like a cloak she'd been born to wear. The Alpha King's name was Calder, and he had ruled the Thornbound for longer than anyone living could remember. Some said he was 100 years old. Others claimed he was twice that. No one knew for certain because no one dared ask, and Calder himself never spoke of time as if it mattered. He was massive, standing well over 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of an entire pack's survival. His hair was long and dark, shot through with silver that caught moonlight like metal, and his eyes were the color of amber with black depths that seemed to hold centuries of decisions both terrible and necessary. He ruled absolutely, not through cruelty, but through the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. When Calder spoke, the pack listened. When he commanded, they obeyed. It had been that way for generations. It was simply how things were. The vow ceremony happened every blood moon, which came roughly once a year when atmospheric conditions aligned to turn the moon the color of rust and old blood. On those nights the entire pack would gather at the standing stones, a circle of 7 massive rocks carved with symbols that hurt to look at for too long. The Alpha King would stand at the center, and one by one, those who had come of age since the last blood moon would step forward and speak the vows. Once spoken, the vows were binding. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally. Something changed in a person when they made the pledge. Their will became tied to the Alpha's will. Their strength flowed into the pack's collective strength. They became part of something larger than themselves, and in exchange they gained the protection and power that came from being thornbound. Rhea had watched the ceremony dozens of times growing up, had seen friends and cousins step forward, speak the words, and emerge changed. They stood taller after, moved with more confidence, seemed to carry themselves with the certainty that came from belonging to something ancient and powerful. She'd looked forward to her own ceremony the way children look forward to crossing thresholds into adulthood. She'd practiced the words until they were perfect, until she could speak them with the right cadence and conviction. She'd prepared herself mentally and emotionally for the moment when she would finally, officially, become thorn-bound. But something had changed in the last year. Something she couldn't quite name, but felt in her bones the way you feel weather changing before it arrives. She'd been tracking a deer through the western reaches of the territory, moving quietly through underbrush, when she'd come across something that shouldn't have been there. A woman, alone, walking through thorn-bound land without permission. Trespassers were dealt with harshly. The pack's laws were clear. Anyone who entered without leave was either turned away or, if they refused, dealt with permanently. Rhea should have reported the woman immediately, should have followed protocol. Instead, she'd watched from hiding, curious about who would be foolish enough to walk these forests alone. The woman was older, perhaps 50, with gray hair bound in a single braid and clothes that marked her as a traveler from the free cities to the south. She walked with purpose, not wandering but heading somewhere specific. Rhea followed her for an hour, staying hidden until the woman reached a small clearing where 7 birch trees grew in a perfect circle. She stopped there and knelt, placing her hands on the earth, and began to speak. Not in the common tongue, but in something older, something that resonated in Rhea's chest like a drum beat. Rhea had stepped out of hiding before she'd consciously decided to move. The woman had looked up without surprise, as if she'd known she was being followed all along. "You're thorn-bound," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Rhea nodded, hand on the knife at her belt. "You're trespassing." The woman smiled, an expression that held sadness rather than humor. "I'm visiting. There's a difference. This clearing belonged to my people before it belonged to yours, before the thorn-bound made their vows, before the Alpha King claimed these forests as his territory." Rhea should have ended the conversation there, should have escorted the woman out or called for others to help remove her. But curiosity was stronger than protocol. "What people?" The woman stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. The unbound, those who chose not to pledge, those who remembered that strength doesn't require submission, that power doesn't require a master. We existed before your Alpha King. We'll exist after him. And we remember what was traded away when the first thornbound spoke their vows. The words felt dangerous, heretical, but they also felt true in a way Rhea couldn't dismiss. What was traded away? The woman looked at her with eyes that seemed too knowing. The right to say no. The right to choose your own path. The right to be strong without surrendering your will to someone else's vision. The first Alpha King, Calder's predecessor, he made a bargain with forces older than wolves or humans. He offered absolute loyalty from his people in exchange for absolute protection. And for 300 years that bargain has held. But bargains made with old powers always come with costs no one talks about. Rhea felt her heart racing. "You're lying. The Alpha protects us, keeps us strong. Without the vows, we'd be scattered, weak, easy prey for those who want to destroy us." The woman nodded. "That's what they teach you. That submission equals safety. That individual will is dangerous. But what if I told you that the Thornbound were stronger before the Vows? That your ancestors chose this path not because they were weak, but because they were afraid? She gestured to the birch circle. This place remembers. Before the stones, before the Alpha King, there were packs that thrived without surrendering their autonomy. They were wild in the truest sense, untamed, and they survived just fine. Rhea wanted to dismiss everything the woman said, wanted to call it lies, propaganda from outsiders who didn't understand the Thornbound way. But something in her resonated with the words. She thought about the vow ceremony, about watching people speak the pledge, and seeing something in their eyes change. Something that looked almost like loss, even as they gained the strength of the pack. She thought about her father, who'd always seemed slightly hollow after ceremonies, as if some essential part of him had been carved away and never returned. The woman had left after that, walking back the way she'd come, and Rhea had let her go without reporting her presence. It was the first time she'd broken pack law, and it had terrified her. But it had also planted something, a seed of doubt that grew over the following months, sending roots through everything she'd been taught to believe without question. She'd started paying attention differently, watching the vow ceremony with new eyes, noticing how those who pledged seemed to lose something even as they gained something else, how they became more certain but less curious, how they moved in lockstep with pack decisions even when those decisions seemed wrong, how they defended the Alpha King with automatic loyalty that never questioned, never doubted, never considered that maybe, possibly, their leader could be wrong about something. And she'd started researching. The Thornbound kept records, oral histories passed down through designated storytellers. Rhea sought them out, asking questions carefully, trying not to seem like she was questioning foundations. She learned that the Vows hadn't always existed, that 300 years ago the pack had been different, more chaotic, yes, more prone to internal conflict, but also more adaptable, more creative, more capable of change. The first Alpha King, Calder's predecessor, whose name had been struck from history, had introduced the Vows during a time of crisis. Enemies from multiple directions, internal strife threatening to tear the pack apart. He'd offered a solution, absolute unity through absolute loyalty, and in their fear the pack had accepted. But what no one seemed to remember, or what they'd chosen to forget, was what had happened to those who'd refused the Vows. The Unbound, as the woman had called them. Rhea found references to them in the oldest stories, mentioned in passing and always negatively. They were called traitors, cowards, weak individuals who'd put personal freedom above pack survival. But the more Rhea dug, the more she found inconsistencies. The Unbound hadn't been weak. They'd been strong enough to walk away from the pack and survive on their own. They'd built their own communities in the free cities, established lives outside the Thornbound structure. They'd thrived in their own way without submitting their will to an Alpha King. The blood moon was approaching. Rhea's 27th birthday had passed 2 months ago, which meant this ceremony was hers. She'd been preparing for this her entire life. Everyone expected her to step forward, speak the vows, and join the ranks of the fully Thornbound. Her father was excited, had spent weeks telling her how proud he was that she was finally ready to pledge. The pack watched her with anticipation, waiting for the tracker's daughter to take her place among them. But Rhea couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the clearing, couldn't stop thinking about what it meant to surrender your will to someone else's vision, even if that someone was a king who'd kept the pack safe for longer than anyone could remember. She thought about her own desires, her own dreams, her own sense of what was right and wrong. She thought about what it would mean to speak those vows and feel that change happen inside her, that shift from individual to collective, from autonomous to bound. She thought about courage. Real courage, not the kind that came from following rules or obeying orders, but the kind that came from standing alone against everything you'd been taught to believe. The blood moon rose on a night when the air smelled of coming rain. The entire pack gathered at the standing stones, hundreds of individuals forming a circle around the sacred space. Fires burned at 7 points, casting flickering light across faces Rhea had known her whole life. Calder stood at the center, imposing and eternal, his amber eyes reflecting firelight in ways that made them look molten. He wore ceremonial robes, dark fabric decorated with symbols of pack history, and around his neck hung the tooth of the first alpha, a piece of bone so old it had turned black. 5 others would pledge tonight. Young people who'd come of age since the last blood moon, all of them eager and prepared. They would go first, establishing the pattern, showing Rhea how it was done, even though she'd seen it dozens of times before. She watched as the first stepped forward, a young man named Torin, who'd trained as a scout. He spoke the vows with clear conviction, his voice carrying across the circle. We pledge our strength to the pack. We submit our will to the alpha. We are teeth and bone and loyalty until death takes us. As the words left his mouth, Rhea saw it happen. Saw something invisible pass from Torin into the collective space of the pack. Saw his posture change, his expression shift, his eyes take on that certainty that came from being bound. Calder placed a hand on his shoulder and power flowed between them, sealing the vow, making it permanent. Torin stepped back, smiling, and the pack welcomed him with voices raised in approval. 4 more followed. 4 more times Rhea watched the vow be spoken and sealed. 4 more times she saw that change happen, that subtle loss of self in exchange for collective strength. And with each pledge, her own resolve hardened. She couldn't do it. Couldn't speak those words and mean them. Couldn't surrender her will to someone else, even someone as powerful and protective as Calder. It wasn't about not trusting him. It was about knowing that once she spoke the vows, she would lose the ability to ever disagree with him. Would lose the part of herself that could say no. When her turn came, the pack fell silent, all eyes on her as she stepped forward into the circle. Calder watched her approach with the patient attention of someone who had performed this ceremony hundreds of times and never once been surprised by its outcome. Rhea, daughter of Marcus, tracker of the Thornbound. He spoke her name and lineage as tradition demanded. You have reached the age of vowing. Do you come forward freely to pledge your strength to the pack and submit your will to the alpha? The traditional response was yes, spoken without hesitation. Rhea opened her mouth to say it and found different words emerging. I come forward freely, but I do not come to pledge. The silence that followed was absolute, not just quiet, but the kind of silence that happens when sound itself is shocked into non-existence. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the fires seemed to burn quieter, as if the flames themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. Calder's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. A spark of something that might have been surprise or might have been warning. Explain yourself. His voice was calm, but beneath it Rhea could hear the weight of centuries of authority, the power of an alpha who had never been defied. Rhea felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. But her voice, when it came, was steady. The vows require absolute submission. They require that I surrender my will to yours, and I cannot do that. Not because I don't respect you, not because I don't value the pack, but because I believe that strength should not require the loss of autonomy, that loyalty should be chosen in every moment, not bound by ancient words that remove the ability to choose. The pack stirred. Whispers rippled through the circle like wind through grass. This had never happened before. No one refused the vows. No one stood before the Alpha King and said no. It was unthinkable, impossible. Yet here was Rhea, doing exactly that. Calder took a step forward, his massive frame blocking out the firelight behind him. You understand what you're doing? You understand what refusal means? Rhea nodded. I'll be exiled. Cast out of the pack, forced to leave the territory, and never return. I understand. But I cannot speak vows I don't believe in. I cannot surrender the part of me that needs to be able to say no. And if I told you the vows exist for a reason? Calder's voice was soft now, dangerous in its quietness. That 300 years ago your ancestors chose this path, because without it, the pack was tearing itself apart? That absolute loyalty is the only thing that has kept us alive when everything else wanted us dead? Rhea met his eyes, those ancient amber depths that had seen more than she could imagine. Then I would say that maybe surviving by surrendering our autonomy is no different than dying. That maybe there's a way to be strong without being bound. That maybe the old powers you made bargains with 300 years ago need to be questioned, not blindly obeyed. The words hung in the air like accusations. Calder stared at her for a long moment, and in that moment Rhea saw something she'd never seen before in the Alpha King's face. Uncertainty. Not weakness, not doubt about his authority, but genuine uncertainty about whether she might be right. It lasted only a heartbeat, then the certainty returned. But she'd seen it, and from the sharp intake of breath around the circle, others had seen it too. Calder raised his hand, and the pack fell silent again. Rhea, daughter of Marcus, you have refused the vow. According to our laws, you are cast out. You have until dawn to leave the territory. You will take nothing with you but what you can carry. You will not return, on pain of death, and your name will be struck from our histories as if you never existed. He paused, and for just a moment his voice held something that might have been regret. May you find whatever it is you're seeking, even if it costs you everything. Rhea bowed her head, not in submission, but in acknowledgment. Then she turned and walked out of the circle. The pack parted before her, none of them meeting her eyes, all of them silent as she passed. Only her father reached out, his hand brushing her shoulder for just a moment. His face was stricken, torn between pride and his daughter's courage and grief at her choice. She touched his hand briefly, then continued walking, out of the circle, out of the firelight, into the darkness beyond. She walked through the forest alone, following paths she'd known her entire life but would never walk again. She had until dawn, perhaps 5 hours, to gather what she needed and leave. She went to her small dwelling on the edge of the settlement and packed quickly. A bedroll, a change of clothes, Her tracking knives, the journal where she'd written notes about the Unbound. Not much, but enough to survive. She was leaving everything else behind. Her home, her father, her entire life. All because she'd said no to a vow. She couldn't speak with honesty. As she packed, she heard footsteps outside. For a moment, she thought it was her father, come to say goodbye properly. But when she turned, Calder stood in her doorway, having to duck to fit his massive frame through the entrance. He looked at her with those ancient eyes, and she saw something in them she'd never expected to see. Respect. "I had to come," he said quietly. "Had to see if you understood what you've done. Not just to yourself, but to the pack." Rhea faced him, chin raised. "I understand. I've broken something that hasn't been broken in 300 years. I've shown that it's possible to refuse, that the vows aren't inevitable, that someone can stand before you and say no." Calder nodded slowly. "Do you know why I trembled? Back there, when you refused?" She blinked. "I saw your eyes, but I wasn't certain." He moved further into the room, his presence filling it entirely. "I trembled because for 300 years I have ruled with absolute certainty. Every decision I've made, every command I've given, has been followed without question. The vows ensure that. They bind the pack's will to mine, make my authority unquestionable, and that certainty has kept us alive through wars and plagues and enemies that should have destroyed us. But it has also made me complacent, made me stop questioning my own decisions because no one else could question them." He looked at her with an intensity that was almost painful. "You stood before me and said no. You, a single woman with no power, no authority, nothing but courage and conviction. And in that moment I realized something I've been avoiding for decades, that a leader who cannot be questioned will eventually make mistakes no one can stop. That absolute power, even when used for protection, is still absolute power. And absolute power corrupts absolutely, given enough time." Rhea stared at him, shocked. "Are you saying I was right to refuse?" Calder's expression was complex, layered with centuries of experience and the weight of decisions he'd made for longer than she'd been alive. "I'm saying you were brave enough to do what no one else has been brave enough to do. Whether that makes you right or wrong, only time will tell. But your courage reminded me that leadership without the possibility of being challenged is not leadership. It's tyranny, even benevolent tyranny. And I've been a tyrant for 300 years without realizing it. Then let me stay." Rhea spoke quickly, hope flaring. "Let me be the voice that questions, the one who can say no when everyone else has bound themselves to saying yes." Calder shook his head. "I can't. The laws are clear. You refuse the vow, you must be exiled. If I break that precedent, everything unravels. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "the unbound woman you met in the clearing, the one you didn't report, she was right about some things. The thornbound were different before the vows, stronger in some ways, weaker in others. And there are others like her, communities of those who chose not to bind themselves, who remembered a different way." "How did you ... Rhea started, but Calder smiled grimly. "I'm the Alpha King. I know everything that happens in my territory. I knew about your meeting the day it occurred. I knew about your research into our history. I knew about every doubt you've harbored for the past year. And I let it continue because I wanted to see what you would do. Whether you'd speak the vows despite your doubts, or whether you'd have the courage to refuse. Why? Rhea demanded. Why test me like that? Because I'm 300 years old and untired. Calder's voice carried a weariness that seemed to age him visibly. I've been Alpha King for longer than anyone should rule anything. I've made decisions that saved the pack and decisions that haunted me. I've used the vows to keep us united and safe, but I've also wondered what we've lost in that unity. What potential has been crushed because everyone must conform to my will. He looked at her directly. I needed to see if anyone in this pack still had the strength to stand alone, to refuse the easy path of submission, and you did. So now I'm going to ask you to do something harder. What? Rhea's voice was barely a whisper. Go to the Unbound. Learn their ways. Understand what we've lost and what they've gained by refusing to pledge. And in 5 years, come back. Not to rejoin the pack, because you can never do that, but to meet me at the boundary stones and tell me what you've learned. Tell me if there's a way for the Thornbound to be strong without the vows. Tell me if I've been a fool for 3 centuries, or if the bargain was necessary after all. He paused. Your courage has reminded me that I need to be questioned, that no one should rule without the possibility of being challenged. So I'm making you my challenger, my conscience. The voice that can say no when everyone else has been bound to say yes. And if I don't come back in 5 years, then I'll assume the Unbound way killed you, and I'll know that the vows, however imperfect, are necessary for survival. But if you do come back, if you survive and thrive and learn something worth sharing, then maybe, just maybe, I'll consider that 300 years of certainty might need to be challenged. Rhea felt tears on her face, surprising herself. She'd thought she was being exiled, in disgrace. But Calder was telling her she'd been chosen for something else. Not cast out, but sent out, given a mission that might change everything. Thank you. The words felt inadequate, but were all she had. Calder moved to leave, then stopped at the door. One more thing. When you stood before me tonight and said no, you weren't just refusing the vows. You were showing the entire pack that it's possible to stand before absolute authority and survive. That courage like yours exists. Some of them will remember that. Some of them will start questioning things they've never questioned before. You've planted seeds tonight, Rhea. Whether they grow into something beautiful or something destructive, only time will tell. But they've been planted, and that matters. He left then, disappearing into the darkness, and Rhea was alone again. But it was a different kind of alone now. Not the isolation of being cast out, but the solitude of someone on a purposeful journey. She finished packing, took one last look at the dwelling that had been her home, and walked into the forest. Heading south, toward the free cities, toward the Unbound, toward whatever life awaited someone brave or foolish enough to refuse the oldest vow in Thornbound history. The journey took weeks. Rhea traveled through forests and over mountains, following directions the woman in the clearing had given her before disappearing. She faced dangers she'd been trained for, and some she hadn't. Bandits on the roads who tried to rob her, and learned quickly that thorn-bound training made even an exiled individual formidable. Creatures in the deep woods that tested her tracking skills and her ability to move silently. Weather that turned hostile without warning, forcing her to take shelter and wait out storms that felt almost personal in their intensity. But she survived. Not just survived, thrived. For the first time in her life, every decision was purely her own. No pack obligations. No alpha authority. No collective or pulling at her choices. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. She learned what it meant to be truly autonomous, to make mistakes that were entirely hers and victories that belonged to no one else. She reached the free cities after 6 weeks of travel. The settlement called Breakwater, built along a river where 3 territories met, governed by a council rather than a king. The Unbound had a presence here, not as a formal organization, but as a loose network of individuals who'd walked away from various packs and clans, who'd chosen freedom over security, autonomy over belonging. She found them in a gathering house near the river, a large building where people came to share news and food and stories. When she entered and announced herself as recently unbound from the Thornbound, conversation stopped. Eyes turned to her with mixtures of curiosity, suspicion, and recognition. A woman stood from the back of the room, and Rhea recognized her instantly. The woman from the clearing, the one who'd planted the first seeds of doubt. "You came," the woman said simply. "I wasn't sure you would." Rhea felt exhausted suddenly, all the strength that had carried her here draining away. "I said no to the Alpha King. I refused the vows, and I survived." The woman smiled, genuine warmth in the expression. "Then welcome to the Unbound. Here, your will is your own. Your strength is your own. And your choices, for better or worse, are entirely yours to make." The years that followed were an education Rhea had never imagined needing. The Unbound didn't have vows or alpha kings, but they had their own structures, their own ways of organizing that didn't require submission. They operated on consensus, on negotiation, on the constant work of coordinating autonomous individuals toward common goals. It was messy, inefficient, sometimes frustrating beyond words, but it was also vibrant in ways the Thornbound had never been. She learned that strength didn't require hierarchy, that protection could come from voluntary cooperation rather than enforced loyalty, that communities could thrive without absolute authority if everyone committed to the harder work of constant communication and compromise. She also learned that the Unbound had their own problems. Without clear leadership, decisions took forever. Conflicts could escalate because there was no final authority to appeal to. Some individuals took advantage of the system, doing less than their share because there was no alpha to enforce consequences. But for all its flaws, she found something in the Unbound way that the Thornbound had lost: creativity, adaptability, the ability to change direction quickly because decisions weren't locked in by hierarchical decree. Different perspectives were valued because there was no single perspective that dominated all others. And individuals grew in ways they couldn't under the vows, developing capacities and skills that would have been suppressed in service of collective conformity. She also learned about herself, about her own capacity for leadership that didn't require dominance, about her ability to influence without commanding, about the strength that came not from binding others, but from inspiring them to choose freely. She became respected among the Unbound, not because she held authority, but because she earned trust, because people saw her courage, her integrity, her willingness to do the hard work of autonomous living. 5 years passed. Rhea grew from a young woman who'd refused a vow into someone who understood both the costs and benefits of that refusal. She'd seen the unbound way at its best and its worst. She'd lived autonomy in all its messy glory, and she'd thought constantly about Calder's challenge, about whether the Thornbound could incorporate anything from the unbound way without losing what made them strong, about whether 300 years of vows had been necessary or whether there was another path. On the 5th anniversary of her exile, she returned to Thornbound territory, not to the heart of it, but to the boundary stones that marked where pack land ended and neutral ground began. She arrived at sunset and waited, building a small fire as night fell. She didn't know if Calder would come. 5 years was a long time. He might have forgotten, might have decided her exile was permanent after all, might have died, though that seemed unlikely for someone who'd lived 3 centuries already. But as the moon rose, she felt him before she saw him. That massive presence, that weight of authority that even distance couldn't diminish. He emerged from the forest alone, no pack members accompanying him, and approached her fire. He looked exactly as she remembered, unchanged by 5 years that had marked her visibly. His amber eyes reflected firelight as he sat across from her, close enough to speak, but maintaining the boundary line between his territory and neutral ground. "You came back." His voice was the same, that quiet absolute that commanded without shouting. Rhea nodded. "I said I would." She gestured to the fire. "I have much to tell you." They talked through the night. Rhea told him about the unbound way, about its strengths and weaknesses, about what she'd learned from living without vows or alpha authority. She told him about the creativity and adaptability she'd found, but also about the inefficiency and conflict. She told him about individuals who thrived with autonomy and others who floundered without clear direction. She told him everything, holding nothing back, giving him the full truth of what 5 years among the unbound had taught her. Calder listened without interrupting, those ancient eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. Finally, he spoke. "I have been thinking for 5 years about what you did, about the courage it took to refuse me, about what it means that I trembled when you said no." He looked up at her. "I am 300 years old. I have ruled with absolute certainty for longer than your grandparents' grandparents lived. And in all that time, I have never once questioned whether the vows were right, never once considered that there might be another way. Your refusal forced me to think, forced me to question, and I have spent 5 years grappling with questions I never wanted to ask." "And what have you concluded?" Rhea asked softly. "That I have been both right and wrong. Right that the vows created unity when we desperately needed it. Wrong that I let that unity become the only option. Right that absolute loyalty kept us alive through crises that should have destroyed us. Wrong that I never considered whether survival without autonomy was worth the cost." He paused. "The pack needs strength, but it also needs the ability to question that strength. It needs loyalty, but it also needs the courage to say no when loyalty requires surrendering conscience. So what will you do?" Calder smiled, a tired expression that held centuries of weight. "I will change nothing about the vows. They will remain as they are, but I will create something new. A position within the pack for someone who has refused the vows. Someone who stands apart from the collective, will but remains connected to the pack. Someone whose role is to question me, to challenge my decisions, to be the voice that can say no when everyone else is bound to say yes. I will call this position the Untamed Voice, and I am offering it to you." Rhea stared at him. "You want me to return to the pack? After 5 years of exile? Not return, not fully. You can never take the vows, never be truly thorn-bound. But you can stand at the boundary, live on the edge of the territory, neither inside nor outside. And when I make decisions, when I lead the pack down paths that may or may not be right, you can challenge me, can remind me that my authority is not infallible, can be the conscience I've needed for 300 years but never had. Why me?" Rhea's voice shook. "Why not someone else? Someone still in the pack? Because you had the courage to say no when it mattered most. Because you survived 5 years among the unbound and came back to tell me what you learned. Because I trust that you will always speak truth to me, even when that truth is uncomfortable." He leaned forward. "I am offering you a burden, Rhea, not a gift. The burden of being the one voice that can challenge absolute power. The burden of standing alone against me when everyone else is bound to support me. It will be thankless work, lonely work, dangerous work, because there will be times when the pack resents you for questioning their alpha. But it is necessary work, and you are the only one I trust to do it." Rhea felt tears burning in her eyes for the second time in 5 years, both times because of this ancient king who kept surprising her. "I accept, then come, not into the territory, not yet, but to the boundary, and we will establish this new position together. Make it official in the eyes of the pack. Show them that refusal of the vows doesn't mean exile forever, that there is a place, however precarious, for those brave enough to stand untamed." They walked together to where the boundary stones marked pack territory. Calder called out in a voice that carried through the forest, and within an hour the pack began to gather. Hundreds of them, emerging from the darkness, forming a circle around the boundary. Rhea saw her father among them, older now but still standing strong. Their eyes met across the distance, and she saw pride there, mixed with grief that had never fully healed. Calder raised his hand, and the pack fell silent. 5 years ago, Rhea, daughter of Marcus, refused the vows. One exiled her, according to our laws. But I also gave her a task, to learn the ways of the unbound and return to tell me what she learned. She has done this, and in doing so she has shown courage that deserves recognition, not punishment. He paused, letting the words settle. I am creating a new position within our structure, the Untamed Voice. This person will live at the boundary, neither fully in nor fully out. They will have refused the vows, maintaining their autonomy, their ability to question and challenge. And their role will be to speak truth to me, to challenge my decisions when they need challenging, to be the conscience of the pack when everyone else is bound to collective will. The pack stirred, uncertain whispers rippling through the gathering. This had never been done before. The idea of someone refusing the vows but remaining connected to the pack was unprecedented. But Calder's authority held, his 300 years of leadership giving weight to his words, even when those words proposed something radical. Rhea has earned this position through her courage, through her refusal to speak vows she couldn't believe in, through her willingness to stand before me and say no. through her survival among the unbound and her return to share what she learned. He looked directly at her. From this day forward, she is the untamed voice, and any who would challenge her must first challenge me. The pack accepted his decree because they had no choice, bound by vows to support their alpha's decisions. But Rhea saw something in their faces. Some looked at her with resentment, others with confusion. But a few, especially the younger ones who hadn't yet taken vows, looked at her with something else: hope, recognition, the understanding that there was more than one path, more than one way to be strong. Rhea stepped forward to the exact line of the boundary, neither crossing into pack territory nor standing fully outside it, existing in the liminal space between bound and free. And she spoke, her voice carrying across the gathered pack. I did not refuse the vows because I'm weak. I refused because I believe true strength requires the ability to choose. I have lived 5 years among the unbound. I have seen what autonomy can create and what it can cost. And I have come back not to reject the thorn-bound way, but to remind us that even the oldest vows should be questioned. Even the strongest alpha should be challenged. Even 300 years of tradition should be examined with clear eyes. She looked at Calder, at the ancient king who'd trembled at her courage, and then transformed that trembling into change. I am the untamed voice, and I will use that voice to speak truth that may be uncomfortable, to ask questions that may be difficult, to challenge decisions that may seem unquestionable, not because I want to destroy what we are, but because I want us to be the best version of what we can be. A pack that is strong enough to allow dissent, unified enough to survive challenge, secure enough in our bonds to question the vows that bind us. The pack was silent. Then, slowly, one person began to clap. Rhea's father, standing at the edge of the circle, his weathered hands coming together in approval. Others joined, the sound spreading through the gathering until the forest rang with acknowledgment. Not everyone participated. Some stood with arms crossed, faces closed. But enough joined that the message was clear. Rhea had returned, and something in the Thornbound had changed forever. Over the years that followed, Rhea grew into her role. She lived in a small dwelling exactly on the boundary line, one wall in pack territory and one wall outside it. She maintained relationships with both the Thornbound and the Unbound, serving as a bridge between two worlds. And she did what Calder had asked. She questioned him, challenged his decisions when they seemed wrong, reminded him of perspectives he might miss from his position of absolute authority. Sometimes her challenges were accepted. Calder would hear her out, consider what she said, and adjust his course. Other times he overruled her, and she had to accept that he was still alpha, still the one making final decisions. But the important thing was that the questions got asked, that someone could say no, that the possibility of challenge existed. And slowly, other things began to change. Young people approaching vow age started asking questions they'd never asked before. Some still took the vows gladly, finding security and strength in being bound. But others hesitated, considered, weighed the costs against the benefits. A few even chose to refuse following Rhea's example. They were exiled as tradition demanded, but they knew now that exile wasn't forever, that there were other ways to live, other communities that valued autonomy, that saying no to the vows didn't mean you were weak or cowardly. The thorn-bound adapted. Not easily, not without conflict, but they adapted. The presence of the untamed voice, the existence of someone who could question the alpha, created space for different perspectives, for creativity that had been suppressed, for innovation that conformity had prevented. The pack remained strong, perhaps stronger than before, because their unity was now tempered with the understanding that unity without the possibility of dissent was just tyranny by another name. Calder lived on, as ancient and powerful as ever, but changed by the trembling he'd experienced 5 years earlier. He ruled with the same authority, but less certainty, the same power, but more humility. He made mistakes still, but now there was someone to catch them, to point them out, to help him course correct. And in his private moments, when the weight of 300 years pressed down on him, he would visit Rhea at the boundary and thank her for having the courage to break the untamed vow, for showing him that even absolute power needed absolute questioning. Rhea herself found peace in the liminal space she occupied, never fully belonging to either the bound or the unbound, but connected to both. It was a lonely position sometimes, standing always at the edge, always questioning, always challenging. But it was necessary work, sacred work, the work of being the voice that could say no in a world that had forgotten how to speak that word. And on certain nights, when the blood moon rose and the pack gathered for vow ceremonies, Rhea would stand at the boundary and watch, would see young people step forward and speak the ancient words, binding themselves to the collective, and she would remember the night she'd stood in that circle and said no. The night an Alpha King had trembled at her courage. The night everything had changed, because one person had been brave enough to refuse what everyone else accepted without question. Every hidden soul carries a fire that breaks rules, awakens kings, and bends destiny. If you've ever felt the pressure to pledge something you didn't believe in, if you've ever stood before authority and felt the weight of expected submission, if you've ever wondered what it would cost to say no when everyone expects yes, share your story in the comments below. Let this be a space where those who've refused to be bound find others who understand. Remember to leave a like if this story reminded you that courage sometimes means standing alone, that questioning authority is not weakness but strength, that the ability to say no is what gives yes its meaning. And subscribe to walk this path with others who know that the most sacred vows are the ones we choose freely, not the ones we're bound to speak. Until the next story, guard your autonomy. Question what everyone accepts. Remember that even the oldest traditions deserve to be challenged by those brave enough to tremble at nothing.